Reo, kei te mihi ki a koutou, e hui hui tahi nei, te whakarewa tia tēnei kaupapa whakahirihira. Nō reira, nau mai, hara mai, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia inoi tātou, whakatakata hau ki te uru, whakatakata hau ki te tonga, kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. E hi ake ana te atakura, he teo, he huka, he hauhu, ti hei Māori ora. Kia ora everybody. It's great to see a fantastic response to our meeting today. So as you know, we've got a pretty busy agenda. So I'd like, how we've organised it, I'm going to just introduce each of the presenters. So we've got three, and Susan will organise the Q&A session. So if you have a question, can you put it up on the chat, and she'll marshal that. So so that's where we're going. So I'll just introduce the first speaker. So our first speaker today is Dr. Oliver Menzies, who's a physician in geriatric and internal medicine, and he will discuss Tūhononga Whaiaro model for mainstream services that support people living with mate wariwari. He will discuss the study to investigate Māori understandings of mate wariwari and develop a framework to inform assessment of cognitive impairment. So I'm presuming that Oliver is somewhere in this large...
Yes, I am.
So I'll turn it over to you, Oliver. Welcome.
Thank you. And I'll just share my screen. So I've got so can everyone see a blue screen? Maybe Teresa. Yep, good. I've got the thumbs up. So the Tūhononga Whaiaro model for mainstream services supporting people living with mate wariwari is the title. My name is Oliver Menzies, and I'm presenting on behalf of the Kauma tuatanga o te roro research rōpū, the study of the aging brain research group. My iwi is Rongo Whakaata and Aitanga Mahaki, which has changed recently as my mum did some digging through our whakapapa and said, actually, it's different. So I'm a geriatrician and general physician working in the mana awhi, older person's health and general medicine departments at Te Toko Tūmai Auckland Hospital. This is the main reference for my talk today. So if you're on Zoom, you can press on your keyboard. If you want to keep that, you can press print screen, and that will save it for later for you to put into a paint program if you want. So I tried to think, what would people want to know out of this presentation, and focus what I'm presenting based upon what I thought people might want to know. So what is it? Why is it needed, and why should you use it? Who is it for? When should you use it? How is it developed? How do you use it? And where does this fit into existing theory as well? Before we get on to that though, some of you for this slide can sort of look away or switch off, or because you'll already know all of this, but I thought it was a useful slide to put in. So thinking of vowels, we've got a, e, I, o, u, and ngā is like in whanganui. So knowing that, so Tūhononga is connection, the macron meaning a long vowel. And then moving down to the other kupu, the other words, putting an A and an I together, a, e, I, ai, so whaiaro, meaning self or personal. So it's the Tūhononga Whaiaro model, TW model. So what it is a model for understanding factors that are important to Māori in the assessment for and the management of Mate Wareware dementia. It's a Māori understanding and assessment of healthy cognition and cognitive impairment. Thinking of why we need it and why to use it. So before this research, Mate Wareware dementia in Māori was an area that really did not have much research completed. The mātauranga or knowledge base was fairly scanty. The kaimahi workers in this space were using research and tools that had been formulated in other cultural and ethnic contexts and using those to try to describe, understand and manage problems with thinking and memory for Māori. That doesn't really sound optimal, but kaimahi workers were doing the best they could with what was available. More recently, the importance of culture has become more widely recognized, and the highly influential publication, the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM, and the more recent versions such as DSM-5 has highlighted this importance. Locally, in the most recent update to their position statement of dementia in older people, the Australian and New Zealand Society of Geriatric Medicine noted the importance of choosing an appropriate cognitive assessment tool for a patient with consideration of their cultural background. Some of you might have even been involved with the genesis of this publication, the New Zealand Framework for Dementia Care, which noted that cultural factors are essential in the assessment and management of dementia. And this is not just opinion. There's a research base indicating that culture affects cognitive assessment, and this review article notes it can affect the validity and sensitivity of translated cognitive assessment instruments. So why use this model? I guess the overall goal is to better understand, diagnose, and manage Mate Wareware dementia for Māori. So for people who identify as Māori, who are known or suspected to have cognitive impairment or Mate Wareware, that's who to use it for, designed with older Māori, but likely also to be of utility for younger Māori as well if you want to use something to assess cognition, assess thinking and memory. So saying for Māori is easy to say, but it doesn't encompass the complexity. And I quite like this quote from Mason Dury, who notes Māori live in diverse cultural worlds. There is no one reality, nor is there any longer any single definition which will encompass the range of Māori lifestyles. And so this tool includes Māori cultural factors, and there'll be some variation of fit using the tool based upon the cultural world that someone lives in. This is a sort of big topic for discussion, but I think from my perspective, keeping it simple though and using it in people who identify as Māori. Now onto how it was developed, then how to use it. So Kauma tuatanga o te roro, the aging brain, is a research study initiated in 2016 and led by Makarena Dudley, who you'll hear from soon, that aims to expand the understanding and knowledge, mātauranga, of dementia in Māori. So there was 241 older Māori and 8 different whānau families participating in 17 face-to-face focus groups across 7 study locations throughout Aotearoa, New Zealand, from November 2016 to August 2017. Interviews were generally conducted on marae, local tribal meeting places, and older Māori were sometimes accompanied by whānau, family, or carers who could take part in the focus groups if they wished. The average age of participants was 76 years, with a range from 50 to 87 years old and 73% female. We met with kaumātua older Māori affected by Mate Wareware, dementia, and their family or caregivers, but we did not exclude older Māori without Mate Wareware dementia if they also wished to attend the meeting. Each focus group was 3 to 4 hours split by meal breaks in a one-day session, and we discussed factors that were important in the causation, assessment and management of cognitive impairment in Te Ao Māori, the Māori world, using a standardized format. We transcribed the audio interview data and checked it for accuracy, and then we coded the data. So coding is the sort of process of systematically labeling and categorizing the data in order to find themes and patterns. So once it was coded, we then identified the themes out of the data, and 6 of the study team were involved in the coding and the thematic analysis part. We presented some of the early findings to kaumātua, who commented on the findings to ensure the findings were tika, so fair or true or valid. And then the themes were developed into a model. And this is the model. I didn't jump straight to this because I wanted to sort of explain how we got to this point, that the basis we used for going through to develop this. And I'm just going to pause for a few moments to let you have a read of that, and then we'll be looking at the components in a bit more detail. And Māori language was important for cognitive health overall. So I'm just going to pause there for a sec so you can have a bit of a look at that. So moving on. So thinking of tūhononga, so connection in particular, connection reflects the importance of connection to and collective to Māori. Thinking of wahi, place, for Māori, connection with land and place is almost always a significant factor in a person's genealogy. The whakapapa can indicate relationship to place, but some people might become disconnected from the land, whenua, recognizing that and living remote to their tribal region. It was important for some participants to have what was described as he taonga o te Māori, in a comfort zone or familiar environment. Thinking then of tūpuna, ancestors, influence of ancestors remains throughout lives, melding the past and metaphorically walking on the shoulders of Māori ancestors, present, future, transmission of experiences, socioeconomic, genetic heritage was felt to be an important determinant of cognitive health. Whānau, family, won't go into detail because of its obvious importance. Whanaungatanga, social connection. So in addition to whānau, family, participants valued their connections with the broader community. Thinking then now of whaiaro or self. So whaiaro focuses on the person. Thinking of the particular components there, wairua and te wahianaro, the spirit and spiritual realm. Spiritual practices occurred through things like karakia and karanga. Hingaro, the mind, wasn't going to go into detail there as well because it was obvious importance. Tuakiri, identity and role. Older Māori, kaumātua can hold various roles within iwi, tribe, and are respected for their knowledge and wisdom and activities they undertake, often tied to a person's role and their sense of identity. Often someone's role might be connected to their sense of identity, and losing those positions might affect their cognitive health and potentially their mana, and we found a connection between this and ability to continue functioning in Te Ao Māori. Then thinking of tinana, body, and things included there were physical activity, medicine, food, change in food compared with pre-European times, medical issues, diagnoses, environmental toxins, smoking. So all of these particular things were things that were identified in these focus group meetings. Now onto how to use it, the practical application. Really we're thinking of, we've identified what the factors are that are important, and then how can we use them? How can we use them? How can we sort of evaluate these themes or domains? How can we then optimize things afterwards? We can design questions to evaluate each of these themes and domains. And this is sort of one example of how to do that. I haven't included all of the domains because I just wanted to show it as an example. So if we're thinking, oh, how do we evaluate wairua? We can say, how do you look after your wairua? One of the questions I use on my ward rounds at Te Tūmai Auckland Hospital is, do you have any spiritual health needs? Do you have any wairua health needs while you're with us? Thinking of hingaro, we can use a formal cognitive assessment tool. And then another example is thinking of tinana, having a think about asking questions about activities of daily living, medical issues, medicines used, any rongo that might be used. So that's just an example, but even better than that is whether we, if we can have a structured way to evaluate these themes. And this was the focus of the second phase of the research, which developed the mana tool. And Makarena Dudley is going to talk about the mana tool next. So I won't go into any detail on that. So after we have evaluated, then next thing is really to have a think about optimizing or managing some of these things which we've identified. So if there's been issue identified that we can try and work on, then try and working on that. So there's been some work done in this area, and work is ongoing. So not topic of talk for today, I don't think. So I haven't seen Makarena's presentation yet, but Makarena has done some work on CST training and also on an online app for education about mate wareware that you can have a look at later if you're interested. And then thinking of prevention as well. So how are we going to try and even before problems develop in some of those areas, how can we strengthen some of those domains, some of those factors to try and protect against mate wareware. So just finally, if you're thinking, where does this fit in to other existing models of health? So this particular model is more focused on cognition, so assessing for and managing mate wareware. There's more general models that are designed for assessing Māori health. So we've got the whare tapa whā there, which is a fairly well-known model. There's also Te Wheki and the Mehana model. Looking at what's sort of similar between them, you'll see that the whare tapa whā domains are pretty strong. Other models have also noted those, and we didn't sort of automatically include them. We asked kaumātua what was important to them, and that's what they told us. So I think that really shows the strength of the whare tapa whā model, that's those particular items are included in all of these models, which I'm showing you here. The red there is just me highlighting some of the differences between the models. So, for example, Te Wheke model has well-being, includes Māori, life force, and whatu manawa, and the Mehana model includes societal structures. So, while the Tūhononga Whaiaro model doesn't have anything sort of, I guess, really unique compared with other models, some of the items there are really the items that that participants told us that was important to them at this stage of life, and in particular in this situation. So it's the model that's most focused on what we're trying to assess. So in closing, and I'm hopefully left a bit of time for questions. So in closing, please consider using this model to help improve assessment and management of Māori wareware in kaumātua and older Māori. And the mana tool is one of the best ways you can use this, one of the best integrated ways you can put this model into practice to perform the assessment, which will help guide management. Thank you for your attention. So time for questions if you got them.
Kia ora, Oliver. That's just such a huge amount of kōrero distilled so beautifully. So if people have a question, could you let us know in the chat, and that way we can go through and call on people as the questions come up.
Just to say, Susan, I can see that Kuratia's got his hand up.
Oh, cool.
Oh, sorry, I muted you by accident.
No, that's right. I muted myself. Kia ora koutou katoa e huhi mai nei mō tēnei rā. Kuratiya simo au no toro e nai nei. Thank you for your presentation. Probably the only question that I have, because it was very interesting. I found it very interesting. So the question that I have is that often we present models for best case scenarios, or for scenarios where traditional structures are still fully in place. But my experience recently has been that often our kaumātua and kuia are not engaged in their traditional support structures as we would have hoped. Many are becoming more and more isolated and separated from their direct whānau. So my question is, for your model and the way that you're looking at this, how are you accounting for, and it's a really good thing that we're approaching from a Māori paradigm, but how are we reflecting that our kaumātua and kuia are not necessarily supported in the traditional structural paradigms? They don't necessarily have whānau living around them and supporting them, and many are becoming more and more isolated. So they're not fully isolated, but they're not fully supported either. I was just wondering how this particular model looks at the changing or evolving face of kaumātua and kuia in New Zealand, particularly in some of the more isolated or rural areas.
Yeah, thanks for the question, and I think it's an important one, and I think partly it touches upon loneliness and isolation, which is a topic that's been sort of identified in the last sort of 5 years ago as a really important thing for all older people, all kaumātua as well as just Māori. I think two of the factors in the model are important there. One, sort of whānau, extended family, but the other is whanaungatanga and social connections. And there may be a little bit of a balance between them. If you've got very strong social connections, then that may sort of take the place of any less strong whānau connections. If you've got both not good whānau connections and not good social connections, then that's something that I guess it will really affect the health of the kaumātua, the older person, and if you identify that's something that might be able to be focused on and a sort of, I guess, a treatment or management plan worked through for the kaumātua. Does that answer your question?
It does. And the only thing that I would continue to feed back to you is that mate wareware is an isolating condition. It isolates you from connections, whānau and community. And the experience that I've seen is that often our kaumātua and kuia have gone through a degenerative process with their social and whanaunga connections that have deteriorated along with their condition. So yeah, just something I suspect that we need to keep in mind when we are looking at our people, because this condition isolates people.
Yeah, not only that is, and it's a bit of a vicious circle, because in research overseas, it's been shown that people in isolation, people who lack social connections, tend to have faster deterioration of their cognitive function as well.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Kia ora, we've got a question from Morgan M. Morgan, would you like to ask your question?
I can't hear a question yet, unless you can, Susan.
No. The question that Morgan had typed in was about who you see this model as being particularly relevant for, and the mana tool that, you know, has built from it. So in terms of different disciplines in particular.
I guess the group of people that we talked to were older Māori and their caregivers, and particularly people with Māori wareware. So that's the idea of who the tool is important for. So it's designed to assess and help guide management and people who people are worried either that they might have Māori wareware or they do actually have Māori wareware. So that's who it's for. And I guess also another question in relation to that is who do we think it will be used by? And really anyone who's in the role of trying to assess or manage or has contact with older Māori where there is a concern about presence or not of Māori wareware.
Thank you, Oliver. Natasha Lewis has a question. Natasha, would you like to ask your question?
Kia ora, yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. I just had a question about kaumātua who may identify as bicultural, particularly with Māori and Pacific backgrounds, as well as maybe their whānau, including carers. You know, has a tool been used in those bicultural or even multicultural contexts, and are there any differences? Just interested.
No, the tool hasn't been sort of assessed in a bicultural aspect yet. Whether any of the participants were bicultural, I couldn't say without sort of going back to the data and seeing what people identified as. So would it be useful in a bicultural situation? I think that the answer would be yes in this situation, because it's probably better than choosing an instrument that is not bicultural at all. So if we were to choose the mini ACE, for example, we know that the ACE and then the mini ACE was not designed in New Zealand, Aotearoa New Zealand at all. So it's better using something that's, I guess, partly directed at the person you're trying to assess, rather than one that is not actually at all, doesn't have any cultural background to the person you're trying to assess.
Kia ora, Oliver. I know that we've got some questions that I think will be answered as Makarena goes through the next stage of taking us through the mana tool. But just to let people know that we will keep a record of all the questions that get asked in chat, and any that we don't cover, we will send on to our presenters and make sure we gather up responses with that to share with you, even if it's after the meeting, and that we will be recording the meeting and it'll be going up on YouTube in the next few days if you want to be coming back or sharing what you've heard today. But a huge thank you to Oliver. And now we're going to turn over to Makarena Dudley, and Teresa will just give us that introduction.
Oh, kia ora no. I'd like to introduce Dr. Makarena Dudley. She's a clinical neuropsychologist. She is a researcher and senior lecturer in clinical psychology and deputy director Māori for the Centre for Brain Research at the Auckland University. She led the team that has developed the Māori assessment of neuropsychological abilities, mana, that's a big mouthful, a cognitive, functional and wellbeing screening tool for dementia in older Māori. So welcome, Makarena.
Kia ora koutou, ngā mihi kia koutou, ko te rarawa te apauri me ngā te kahunga iwi, ko te rarawa, ko rangihiki te awa, ko manukau tuku marae, ko Makarena Dudley toku ingoa, ngā mihi. So I'm just going to share my screen as well. And hopefully, yeah, I thought that might happen. Oh, that too, we don't want to see that, do we? There we go. So let's go to up here. We'll go to just move this down. Oh, sorry. We can just move this down. Okay, I'm having a bit of trouble. Oh, here we go. Slideshow. Okay, we're there. So, like all psychometric tools of this nature, we usually have an acronym for them. We have called this tool the Māori, the mana tool, which stands for the Māori Assessment of Neuropsychological Abilities. It's not happening. Okay, so as Oliver has already mentioned, we base the mana tool, we developed the mana tool from the ground up, if you like, and because we wanted a tool that was obviously acceptable to kaumātua, to our kaumātua. So in order to do that, as Oliver's already explained, we did do a hikoi around the mutu and talk to kaumātua. We were funded by the Health Research Council of New Zealand, and we had aims for that original study to investigate the Māori experiences and understandings of dementia, and to develop a Māori free diagnostic tool to detect dementia. Now, my background is in neuropsychology, and actually, in fact, the neuropsych fraternity is known for decades that there is cultural bias in these types of tools. So when it came about that it was realised there was cultural bias in the detection of dementia in Māori in the current tools that were being used in Aotearoa, I was approached to potentially develop a tool that would be culturally fair Māori, if you like. And I jumped at the opportunity because, as I already stated, I'd seen over the years practicing as a clinician that there was this cultural bias inherent in the tools that we had that we imported and use people. So I was really keen for that, to do part of that. So I've had a fantastic team of investigators working alongside me, with Oliver Menzies and Garrett, who's I think really the only Māori biostatistician in the country, Professor Denise Wilson, Hinimoa Elder, and Dame Nada Glavish has been our sort of support person all the way through. We've had to bring on, we have brought on a special advisor group who are non-Māori and who are really keen and very excited about being part of producing this tool. So I want to acknowledge Professor Lynette Tibbett, who is probably one of the most senior neuropsychologists in the country, Gary Shong, Professor Nari Kirst, and Dr. Sarah Cullum, who are all experts specialised in other people's health and Mate Wareware dementia in particular. Okay, so all the way through, we have had a strong kaumātua group, Rōpū, to guide us. And, you know, any of the work that I do, I always run it past our kaumātua first. And indeed, even before we started on this journey, I went north to where I'm from and sought permission, if you like, from my kaumātua to go ahead and proceed with this journey. And of course, you know, there was overwhelming support for it. And indeed, that's the response that we've got from kaumātua all over the motu. So, and we have regularly consulted with our own kaumātua group comprising of Dame Nader Glavish, Matua Piripi Daniels, who was a significant person in the development of this tool, however, who sadly passed away 2 years ago. Dr. Waiora Port, Matua Sunny Niha, Whaia Dau McGregor, Whaia Kahupau, Ngā Wai Rongo Hiruini, and Whaia Moi Nong have all played significant part in this. As well as our kaumātua Rōpū, we have consulted with other kaumātua throughout the motu on the odd occasion, well, on quite frequent occasions actually. So we've brought them up to Auckland, Tāmaki Makaurau, got them to look at the tool before we sort of moved to the next step. So there was ongoing consultation with kaumātua groups from around the motu. Oliver had 241, so yeah, 230 plus kaumātua we interviewed from 7 different regions. We wanted to try and get as much of a representation of iwi as is possible, given the resources that we had to work with. And yeah, also Oliver's been through the rest of that. We did start up in Kaitaia, which is where I'm from, and we had groups about this size. This was pretty average. In Whakatane, we had an enormous group. We had about 60 people, and the same down in Otautahi. So lots and lots of interest in this kaupapa. And this was this was in Whakatane, and this was Oliver providing, after the focus groups interview, where we sort of explored and asked questions and asked partai of the kaumātua. They had questions to ask of us, and so Oliver provided a feedback session at the end of each hui that we attended. So some of the main points I just wanted to go through. Generally, the kaumātua, not generally, but overwhelmingly did not like the word dementia or Alzheimer's. And of course, we all know there's a lot of stigmatization associated with that. So by and large, the name or the words that were most frequently used across the different iwi was the term mate wareware. Of course, many of you already know mate means, in this context anyway, means to be sick or unwell, and wareware means to be forgotten, so or to forget. Another aspect that came out of the kōrero that really jumped out to us is that wairua is the most important aspect of their health and well-being. And I heard many kaumātua say, you know, I go to the doctor, go to the GP, and they ask me all these questions about this, that, my meds and everything else, but they don't ask about my wairua, about, you know, which is actually more important and more importantly, more a part of their health and well-being than the medical types questions that were being asked of them. So they wanted to be asked about their wairua. There generally is a lack of information about mate wareware right across the motu for Māori, and that is even worse. The situation is even worse for those whānau who live in isolated country areas. That definitely needs addressing. And a lot of the kaumātua said that they wanted to, you know, have a model, which is what actually has been part of what prompted Oliver's work about dementia or mate wareware from a Māori perspective. So they were just some of the main themes or ideas or feelings or thoughts that came out of the data once we looked at it. And that's a paper that, I've gone back. That's the paper that that Oliver has already mentioned, and you can take a screen print of that as well, a screenshot of that as well if you wish. It's quite interesting reading. So we come to the actual mana tool. So it's been quite a journey. Unfortunately, we were interrupted by the COVID, the onset of COVID. So we've had quite a number of setbacks, and of course, you know, this is a very vulnerable population, and so a lot of our hui were put on hold. So we've been going for a number of years now. We actually started late 2016, but we are all, you know, we are there. We're at the end of the journey now. Now, I mentioned in a previous slide how Waiaro is important to our kaumātua. That's what they want to be asked about more than anything, in fact. So what we decided, what was decided with consultation, as I've said, is that we would have, unlike any other diagnostic tool in the world, we would have a Waiaro component as well as a functional component and a cognitive component. And I'll show you a few examples of the questions that are asked in those different components. So the Waiaro component, the assessment process starts off with a Waiaro component, and as you can, is obvious, it's part of rapport building, but more importantly, it's an opportunity for the kaumātua to develop some sort of trust with the clinician. I was asked beforehand, by the way, who was this primarily for? So we had to, and that was something we gave a lot of thought to. So most of the clinicians who do diagnose mate wareware in New Zealand are not Māori. So we had to take that into consideration. We had to make it a tool that was one that the clinicians would actually use. So what we did was we had to think about walking down the middle pathway, if you like, between Tauranga Māori and Western knowledge. For that reasons, because we want the clinicians to use it, but we need them to have faith in it. We need them to have confidence in the tool. One of the things that we've done in the tool is that we've provided phonetic spelling of the kupu, the Māori kupu that we have included. Just to help, you know, because some of us can get, or some of our kaumātua can be quite offended when they hear our kupu being, you know, tragically pronounced quite badly. So we've done that. That's just one of the small things that we've done. We've included Māori content where we can. We were also very aware and very keen. Obviously, we were not keen's not the word. We were very alert to the fact that we had to be asking questions that actually arrive at a diagnosis of mate wareware. So we had to get the medical advice, but contextualize it, if you like, as much as we could within a Māori, within Te Ao Māori. So here's the Waiaro component. We'll just next slide. So here are some of the questions we asked regarding the within the Waiaro component, and they're based on some of the those components that Oliver spoke about: wahi, whānau, whanaungatanga, tūpuna, and identity roles. And so that's what we considered to be important in terms of one's Waiaro. Where is the place that you feel most connected to? Where is the place you most want to live? Do you have enough of your own space where you live? What things do you do to help you feel at peace? And is Waiaro important to you? Other questions: how are you? I can't quite see that one up the top myself. Anyway, let's go to question 8. Have your roles in your whānau or your whare or your community changed? If you feel hoha, how do you manage this? You know, I've been administering neuropsych tests for mainly people with traumatic brain injury for about 20 odd years. And then we did a study about 15 years ago, and we just changed some of the words within the test, and we can put Māori kupu in there. And the response from the Māori sample, the Māori participants within that study, was overwhelming. They loved the idea. They loved the fact that there were Māori kupu in there. It made them like, yeah, this is about me, you know. I belong to this. This is it's not something that's foreign and Pākehā that they, you know, kind of feel quite removed from. So even just having Māori kupu in there certainly I think it will make a huge difference. One of the other thing I did want to mention is, of course, we want to produce a tool that accurately detects mate wari. But the other very important aspect of this whole thing was that we wanted to take away the trauma of what our whānau go through when they are being assessed. And that came through a lot from the stories that we heard from the kaumātua. We wanted to make it a more, as you know, given the circumstances, given the condition, and given the possibility of a positive diagnosis, if you like, we wanted to make the journey, or the assessment process anyway, as pleasant, if you like, for Māori whānau. And so and hence the reason why, you know, we have the Waiaro component, and we've just tried to make it as friendly, if you like, as possible, which I think is important, because that means you're going to get good engagement for the whānau and the person that you're interviewing. So, okay, we'll just move to the next one. The functional tool, I'm just going to give you a few examples of the different components. The functional component is given to the whānau to complete. This is not the final version of it. We are still really just working on the formatting of it. So in the Waiaro component, there are 11 questions. In the final functional component, there will be about, I think, about 20 questions in the end. And these questions have all been so that what we did was we looked at the tools that are currently utilised to evaluate functional ability in New Zealand at the moment, and here's a list of them here, and I'm sure many of you health workers are familiar with these tools. So we use these tools. We had a look at each one of the tools. We kind of weighted the domains, and the domains that had the most weighting, those were the areas that we focused on. So the functional tool, we are looking at anxiety, apathy, social awareness, disinhibition, personal care, anger, mood, sleep, hallucinations, and delusions. And those are the areas that we are asking questions about, and the activities of daily living were included, you know, financial skills. The cognitive assessment, it's just about there. This has been probably the most tricky. So this is obviously the one that we administer, the component that we administer to the person who who's been assessed for mate wari. At this stage, there are 18 questions, which is quite long, but we are going to be shaving it back to probably 14 to 15 questions. And once again, we drew on so a lot of the study, one of the prompts, or one of the events, if you like, that triggered us doing the mana tool was the fact that the Australians had developed the the Kimberley Indigenous cognitive assessment tool in Australia for Aboriginal people. And so we've sort of taken the lead from them, and we actually went over there and consulted with them about, you know, what their processes, and so we've built on that to some degree. We've also looked at the FAB, the CAMCOG, the modified mini mental state exam, the MOCA, the ACE3, and the RUDAS. Those are the tools that we looked at in terms of what's commonly used in Aotearoa for cognitive assessment. And these are the domains that we looked at and focused on, and once again weighted, and those are the tools, those are the domains that we are evaluating in the mana tool. I just need to go back there because, so I'll just give you just a couple of the examples, and I was talking about making it Māori friendly. Māori familiar. We want the content to be familiar. We want our whānau to feel like this is about them, you know. So in picture naming, which is one of you, as many of you know, is one of the abilities that is lost in the early stages in Mate Wareware, we have asked them to identify these types of items. And what we've also included are alternative scoring items. So, for example, for the first one, we could have a whare nui, a whare tangata, a whare tūpuna, a marae, whatever. There's a whole range of acceptable alternative scorings that you know, where the patient is correct. And this came on the back of the WACE scoring criteria, where in a study back earlier in 1993, I think it was, the guys, the Māori guys who was made up the sample of that study were answering questions like, for example, what does domestic mean? And some of those guys were saying, well, that's a fight with the missus, that's an argument with the missus. And of course, that's not in the scoring criteria, so they got marked wrong. But of course, actually in their world, they're not wrong, they're right. So they should have been marked right. So we've made sure that all the alternative, you know, answers that might come up are going to be included. So, and the second one, kuni, puaka, pig, however, not dinner, and so on. So here's another example, the attention task. And so we've asked them to spell the word kai backwards. And if the person can spell, ask them if they can spell the word kai. If they can't spell the word kai, there is a strong suspicion that that person may not have had education, because some of our, as you know, some of our kaumātua have had very little formal education, so they may not know how to spell. That doesn't mean that's not necessary, and that's not indicative of their cognitive abilities. So that question was put in there to rule out people who have not had education, a formal education, which was one of the biases that exists in the mainstream questionnaires that are asked. If they can spell the word kai backwards, then we carry on and with that particular task and ask them to spell the word hongi backwards. And so that's okay. If they, right back to the beginning, if they can't spell the word kai, then the administrator would automatically revert to 12B, which is a digits backward task, and deemed to be easier to read or to say words, recall words, or read words backward rather than spelling backward. So that's what we've done in order to try and get around that difficulty, that problem. So a lot of controversy around the visual spatial drawing. We do have, at this stage, we have this, which is, as you know, a kuru. It's quite, people do find it difficult, but it has got some discrimination traits to it. So we are having discussions at the moment. Now, there is also the intertwining circles, which is another visual spatial drawing task that is part of the test, or the infinity loops, as some people call it. And there's also the cube, which some of you will be familiar with. We are thinking of keeping them all in at this stage. We don't want to get rid of the kuru, although at first it seems difficult. But for cultural purposes, we really do want to keep something in there that obviously arises or comes from Te Ao Māori. So at the moment, we are considering keeping it in. There's also, and so Oliver has put the history taking together component. So really together with the history taking and with medical examination and perhaps some other supplementary assessments, this could be a gold standard. The mana could be part of a gold standard assessment. The question that was asked, could this be for bicultural people? For, of course, all Māori are bicultural. But if a person is, for example, Māori and Pacifica, this particular, the mana tool has been tested on anybody who identifies as Māori. We didn't take into consideration, we haven't recorded what other, ethnic groups that person might belong to. However, I just want you to know that the Pacifica, some of my Pacifica colleagues at the University of Auckland are gearing up to prepare and to develop and devise a tool appropriate for the Pacific population as well. But I would imagine, so we are going to be looking at how we're going to launch it, how it's going to be rolled out. And I would think that the corridor would be that the patient would have an option of whether or not they wanted to, to have this tool used with them. In terms of the validation of the mana tool, we have validated it on 89, and that's not too bad actually in terms of neuropsychological tests. The Kika, which has been proven to be very successful in Australia, was validated on 75 people. So pretty happy about that. 31 of our participants came out of the memory clinic at Middlemore, and the others out of Rotorua, and as well as Rotorua Hospital and Queen Elizabeth Health in Rotorua as well. And then we recruited 58 at random from the community. So 33 had dementia, 12 with MCI, and 42 with no dementia, which is a pretty good balance. So the memory clinic participants, they were administered the mana tool because they already had their gold standard assessment, and the community participants who we brought into the study underwent a psychiatrist assessment by our psychiatrist, and then a week or two later at the most, they were administered the mana tool. And then, of course, we've compared the results of, or the outcomes of those assessments. This is just one slide just on the cognitive tool. We will obviously be publishing all the data analysis on the tool, but as you can see, the dementia, those with in blue, generally overall it's a good fit. The cognitive tool, we're happy with the outcomes. Maybe, and what all we need to do is that we need to work on cutoff scores at this point in time. But generally, it does discriminate people with non-dementia as opposed to people with dementia. And ko matu tēnei kōrero ngā mihi. I have no idea what my time frame is.
Kia ora, Makarena, thank you. I'm going to hand over to Susan, who's going to facilitate the question.
Kia ora. Just have a look to see again if people are happy to put their question in the chat. Joe O'Neill, would you like to ask your question?
Kia ora, Makarena. Wonderful presentation, thank you. I was just wondering, coming from the aged care sector, the documentation is absolutely wonderful, and we've been wondering how to really integrate te reo and imagery into some of the documents that we use. So how do we get access to them so that we can start to look at how we can really learn from those documents?
Oh, you mean from them? How can you access the mana tool?
Yes.
Yeah. No, you can't at the moment. Unfortunately, we are planning with through the Dementia Mati Wareware Leadership and Advisory Group. We are planning on launching the mana tool in August, and so then it'll go public. then you will have easily have access to it. You'll be able to download it easily. But we will, you know, we will let you know.
Thank you so much. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Kia ora. Annette Rotherham, would you like to ask your question?
Oh, kia ora. Thank you very much. I really thought that was a wonderful presentation, Makarena. I'm actually in the process of developing a patient-reported outcome measure for conversation and aphasia, and I have, I know the process you're going through to look at other tools and see how we can make them more appropriate for the people we're working with. Do you think the cultural validation process, because as a clinician and as a speech therapist, we have so many tools that have never been tested on Aotearoa population, and particularly not cultural validation. Do you think there is a process that we should pursue to make the tools we're using more appropriate?
Yeah, I mean, what I've done in the past is we've got, for example, the 1066 diagnostic tool. What we've done is, and we're going to be using it in the prevalence study, which we're about to start. What we've done is we've brought together groups of kaumātua generally, but others as well, people working in, you know, Māori working out there in the field, bringing them together, working through it systematically to, you know, to bring a cultural perspective to it, a Māori cultural perspective to it, and just getting consensus around the table, and then maybe, you know, going away and making those changes, then following up, going back to another group, and that sort of iterative process of getting consensus amongst Māori. That's what I've done on, you know, quite a number of tools that we've looked at modifying.
No, great thought process. Thank you very much.
Kia ora. And Rosalind.
Kia ora. I was just asking questions like, who's going to administer the tool? Is it just primarily around the psychiatrists and that, especially with the lack of them anywhere in the world? So
no, I mean, any health professional will be able to administer it. I think, you know, so for a gold standard diagnosis, it would have to be an association in not collaboration, but alongside other tools as well to get that gold standard diagnosis. But no, we're going to make it so that anybody, nurses, you know, anybody really can use it. Well, anybody within the health field can use it. And what we're working on eventually is that we want to develop a bedside tool very much along the lines of the mini ACE in terms of length, and we're looking at calling that the mana iti, but that's just, and that should follow on quite quickly as well.
Thank you.
But no, any health worker would be able to administer it.
Thank you.
Kia ora. Now, I know that people would probably love, Makarena, to have you settle in for the rest of the day, but I know that we are also going to hear from Sally and her team. But I'm just going to ask the group, one of the things that the Dementia Leadership and Advisory Group have asked us to do is to, as part of the gathering of support for the mana, to help make it make as much of an impact as we can, is to actually gather the endorsement of the network so that we can send our araha and our respect for this work that has been done. And so we are going to try doing this by putting up a little poll so that we have something formal that says that we as a network are giving our support to this work. So if Bevan, can you put up our poll for us? This is just we were kind of thinking of doing a way of raising hands, or
yeah, it's already up, and quite a lot of people have already answered, which is great.
Am I allowed to make one more comment?
Absolutely.
So this is the first draft, or the first version, if you like. it may not be the last. We may build on it as they've done with the Kika in Australia and refine it, refine it to make it even more, more of an accurate tool for our people. So, yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
Kia ora. Now, Bevan, if people can't see it, and that.
What was it? Sorry, Susan.
If people can't see that yet, will it just come up on screen?
It should just come up on screen. Yeah.
It pops up.
Yeah. We've got 77% of people have answered it. So the other thing we can do is we can just keep it running in the background. So we don't have to. I think you should be able to. Yeah.
Excellent. All right, we'll gather that up near at the end. So, Teresa, shall I hand over to you to introduce the final session for today?
Sure. Thank you. So, our last presenters is Sally Aydon, and she's the manager from InterRAI Education and Support Services at InterRAI New Zealand. And Sally and her team will discuss the project to develop a culturally appropriate assessment model for InterRAI in New Zealand. So InterRAI Services partnered with Manatū Hauora and consulting agency Francis Health, and used a co-design approach with the community to develop the model. So this is their culturally appropriate model for InterRAI assessments. I'll hand over to you, Sally.
Thank you. Thanks for that. And kia ora, thanks, Teresa. Yes, ko Sally Aydon toko ingoa, registered nurse and is manager of InterRAI Education and Support Services. I have with me Gabriel Stent, who will share the presentation shortly. I do have recognised some names as I scrolled through, and know that some of you will be familiar with what InterRAI is, but others may not. So I'll just go into a little bit of background about what InterRAI is first, and then we'll share our presentation. So InterRAI is an international assessment tool. It's an instrument suite and used in over 46 countries around the world. We currently use 7 different assessments of that suite, and some of them have been used in New Zealand since 2010 and mandated since 2012 for use in the community. So anyone over 65 years, and some younger, but the majority, anyone under the Health of Older Persons funding for services provided in their home have to have an InterRAI assessment to get those services, funded services. In 2016, it was mandated that everyone in aged residential care was to have a long-term care facilities InterRAI assessment. Again, anyone that's in aged residential care funded by the government. It's a comprehensive assessment. There are items that cover the cognitive performance scale. So interestingly, when I saw the MANA assessment, and one of the items there was looking at finance, difficulties managing finances, and that's one of the items in the home care assessment completed in the community, and that feeds into the cognitive performance scale for early detection of mate wareware, and again validated. All the outcome scales are validated against gold standard assessments internationally. So that's just a wee bit of background on what InterRAI is, and I'll ask Gabriel to share the presentation, please. Thank you. Thanks, Gabe. So culturally appropriate being aware and responsive to beliefs and convention that may be determined by cultural heritage. So I'll just ask the next slide. Thanks, Gabes. So a bit of the background, as Teresa mentioned, in 2020, Tenzing Management and Technology Consultants were contracted to undertake a review of InterRAI services. And Tenzing engaged broadly across the health and disability sector, working with Manuta and CTAS through it, or Central TAS as we were then, throughout their review. When the review was presented, there were 11 recommendations that ranged across governance, education, data and assessment. And all recommendations were approved by Dr. Ashley Bloomfield. The culturally appropriate assessment model was one of those recommendations, and it was originally set in recommendation 3, and it was felt that that needed to move to a higher priority. So, thank you. So because we're looking at equity, it needed to move up into one of the higher, so it was moved to recommendation 2. And as you can see with this slide, one that you will probably all be very familiar with, equity recognises that different people with different levels of advantage require different approaches and resources to get equitable health outcomes, which sits with the Y2575. So the first, of course, if we're looking in the first image, it's assumed that everyone will benefit from the same supports. They're all being treated equally. In the second image, individuals are given different supports to make it possible for them to have equal access to the game. They're being treated equitably. And in the third image, all 3 can see the game without any supports or accommodations because the cause of the inequity was addressed and the systemic barrier has been removed. Thanks, Gabe. So in the work that was completed by Deloitte, I must have missed that completely. So Deloitte's today, so the work that was completed by Deloitte when looking at the culturally appropriate assessment model was Māori-led and worked with the Kaumātua around the motu, and it was looking at the principles here of that Māori live and learned experiences were leading this work. There was respect given to time and conversation, at the importance to prioritise kaumātua and whānau voice, and the cultural safety is prioritised in all areas of work, and adhering and upholding tikanga kaumātua and tikanga Māori. So the work that was completed as part of the Deloitte's project last year was looking at how existing InterRAI assessments were completed, what the current perceptions were, the barriers, Māori values, and insights and feedback. So to provide insights into how the Māori how the current InterRAI assessment model was perceived by Te Māori perspectives, and to identify key barriers to a culturally appropriate assessment model. They looked at outlining an assessment model that is grounded in Māori values, and then presented the insights and recommendations from the testing of the proposed model, and then provided recommendations to InterRAI services. And we aim to take those, once we've done further testing, to the wider health and disability sector. The approach was to prioritise the kaumātua and whānau voice, to understand what's important to them, and therefore the team was, as I said, Māori-led and included kaumātua and Māori subject matter experts. Okay. The findings, this was quite a powerful quote from one of the kaumatua, that they don't have to look like me, they just have to understand me. I was at a all of Te Whatu Ora meeting this morning where it was mentioned that 7.5% of our nurses are Māori. And given that percentage, we have a very large percentage of non-Māori assessing kaumatua in the community. And so the model must prioritise and embody our Māori approach through the whole process that can be adhered to whether or not the assessor is Māori. Okay. So looking further at analysing the findings of the work done by Deloitte's, kaumatua and assessors both acknowledge the time constraints and challenges to complete assessments. Anybody working in the community doing assessments for supports will know that it's very time pressured. They assessors will often go in, they'll have about an hour with the people that they're assessing. The kaumatua described the assessment as meeting with a stranger. They were clear that being comfortable with the assessor is a prerequisite to a successful assessment in which goals and aspirations are shared openly and honestly. A commitment which is achieved through relational engagement. So initial time was required to enable more than one visit. An initial visit to form a relationship was trialled, followed by a second visit in which the assessment was completed. Knowing there would be ongoing engagement and follow-up was also a priority. So often after an assessment, the InterRAI assessment findings go back to the Needs Assessment Service, and then a provider is engaged. So a home-based support provider is engaged. The provider will go to the house, introduce themselves and start caring for that person. Yes, thank you. Right, Francis Elfton started that. So it's kaumatua wanted there to be a handover period so that they were introduced to the provider by the assessor. Thanks, Gabe. So development of the model, how can we plan to influence equity if we don't know what is important for the person's health outcomes? So Waikato Māori NASC teams Te Aromatawai model has played a key part in shaping the components of the proposed model. Māori values are weaved into the assessment process. So the initial referral is to, when we're looking at that, whakawhanaungatanga is to reduce the barrier that may be contributing to inequity, capture key information that identify important cultural needs, builds an understanding for kaumatua of the process. The first contact, confirm the kaupapa of the referral, the reason for it, and the assessment process is explained, and that start building that connection. Ascertain culturally appropriate ways in engaging language, tikanga, whānau present, and achieving understanding for consent to be obtained. Then building connections, be a good manuhiri, be a good visitor. Assessors education so they are knowledgeable about how to engage with kaumatua in their homes, building rapport, use of mihi and hui processes, and engaging kaumatua and whānau to tell their story. And then wellbeing assessment. So this is the actual InterRAI assessment. So empowering kaumatua to lead the conversation during the assessment. Often the assessment kaumatua felt as though it was just a tick box, that somebody was sitting there just going through item after item, question after question, whereas all the information in an InterRAI assessment can be gained through conversation. Tell me about your day. How do you manage to get out of bed? How do you start your day? Once you've built a rapport, these are questions that can be asked rather than, can you stand up on your own? Can you have a shower on your own? It's about having a conversation, something that's engaging, and then looking at the follow-up. So a personal, so just tapu can be interpreted as sacred or defined as spiritual restriction, containing a strong imposition of rules and prohibitions. So it's talking about something without overreaching. Thanks, Gabe. So the assessment model encompasses the InterRAI assessment. The InterRAI assessment itself is such a small part of the model that has been developed. We have influence now to further test, to further pilot the model, and we have reached out to NASCs who are happy to do that, to further test the pilot the model, sorry, and following that we will be making recommendations, because as you can imagine, a lot of this is about time, giving more time to that referral process, allowing a second visit so that a better rapport can be built up between the assessor and the kaumātua and the whānau, and that sits outside our scope as education and support, and as InterRAI, we teach the assessment. We aren't NASCs, so NASCs will need more time to provide those assessments. But we will make recommendations and following the further piloting. Thank you, Gabe. And happy to take questions.
Thank you, Sally. I'll hand over to Susan.
Thank you very much to Sally and Gabrielle. Now, I know that InterRAI has a question about training and how that can be supported, and I wonder if perhaps InterRAI, if you would like to address that question to both Sally and Gabrielle and to Makarena as well.
Sure. Kia ora, Susan, kia ora whānau, mai te wao o tautahi, wāhi. And that was after Whaia Makarena's presentation on mana. InterRAI is it's good to expand mainstream kaupapa. But so I don't have a question for InterRAI. It was mainly obviously seeing that Whaia, the mana team would have this on your radar, Ministry of Health, Whatu Ora, seeing that there will be training obviously to flow out from this to Arohe and to us clinicians who are already in this space. So I was just making sure that we wouldn't be missed off once it's all ready to go. Too excited to say, oh, we can't miss this opportunity. And Neira te mihi, also to say allied health, and what does that look like if we're able to inform our kaiawhina, kai tautoko in the community around train the trainer, and really wrapping around a whānau approach to the delivery of mana as well. So that's exciting. So kei te pai, mauri ora.
Can I just say that there will be a video that will accompany the release and the publishing of the mana tool, which you will be able to learn from.
Kia ora. Thank you, Makarena. Now, Wilma, I see that you have your hand up there. You will have to unmute yourself, Wilma.
I think all the kōrero has been fantastic today, and that tool focused at Māori is well overdue, really well needed. But my issue is that what we're seeing now in home-based services is people with significant dementias having visits 3 times a day, or if they need long-term placement, they have to leave area. They have to go somewhere else because we literally have no beds whatsoever. So it's sort of, they counteract each other, although your assessment's being done appropriately, to then say, well, the family have to separate and live huge distances apart is not supportive of it, is it really? And my other concern is with these people who are being cared for in their homes under NAS contracts, 3 visits a day, but that's not to say if that person wanders out of the house after that. And the temperatures we have down here in Taupo Turangi, they could be dead by the morning. So it puts a lot of responsibility on people.
It does. Thanks, Wilma. Yes, I was at a hui last week and heard a case similar where someone had a family member who was going to need to move out of the district for placement. Yeah. Very tragic, isn't it?
It is.
And we've got some comments coming through about just really supporting the emphasis that Sally and Gabrielle, that you and Makarena have been bringing forward about how that conversational style of information gathering is so useful, and that it is something that needs to be a focus of training. So supporting the mahi that's been going on. Now, did I see that Tanya had her hand up? Sorry, Tanya, I've just lost you there, but did Tanya have a question there?
I'm Tanya and I'm from Mary Potter here in Wellington, and I just wanted to say thank you for doing this work. This is exceedingly difficult work to do, to devise a validated assessment tool, and I just wanted to thank Makarena again for doing this work.
Thank you, Tanya. And Maria Clark, so you have your hand up too.
Kia ora koutou. I wanted to make a comment around the InterRAI assessment tool. I sat on the expert Māori advisory panel for the development of that cultural framework. I throughout the whole of the development of that tool, we referred to it as a framework because it sits over the top of the clinical assessment. So the clinical assessment of the InterRAI tool never changes, but the kōrero that you got from Māori working up towards the development of that tool was quite clear that the InterRAI assessment clinical tool was the issue for Māori. Whereas when you look at the mana tool is an assessment, which is what we called out for. There were some boundaries around the scope of the kōrero when it came to the development of the InterRAI cultural framework. And the key scope was that the InterRAI assessment tool couldn't be touched. Because from Māori's view, and we heard that quite clearly through the panel, is that the outcome of an InterRAI assessment is about the funding, and it lands Māori.
Oh no. Maria, no.
That came out of that, Sally. So, that's...
yeah, my understanding in speaking to the group that presented the project to us, that they were, and that spoke to the board, that the InterRAI assessment itself was fine. It was the process around the assessment that was the issue. It needs to be a comprehensive clinical assessment. And it was, as I say, the report showed that the assessment, InterRAI assessment itself there was no issue with it. It was the process around it, as you said, the framework that needs to change.
Yeah, I disagree with that, and you'll see that anyway. Anyway, I think my kōrero is if the mate wareware have in a tool have developed a culturally appropriate assessment tool, then why can't the InterRAI system do that for home and community? Because that's where the key supports come for Māori, is out of that InterRAI assessment tool. Perhaps they should have been combined.
Yeah, the key differences really, I think, are including te reo, including other items like that, rather than changing the actual items in the assessment. It's being more inclusive, which is sorry, there's a push on our rooms here, and so I'll just walk and talk. So there's no issue with an assessor actually talking to the items in te reo to kaumatua. It's simply it's still a comprehensive assessment, no matter how it's asked. If there's a better way to find out about somebody's day, then they speak to them in that way.
Gabrielle,
that's not new, for Māori providers. That's not new, because that's all about a conversation.
Yeah, so that's what an InterRAI assessment can be, a conversation.
can I just invite, I see that Gabrielle has wants to come in here.
Kia ora, and kia ora Maria. Thank you for sharing your concerns there. As part of the work done with Deloitte last year, I spent some time with Michael from Deloitte working through the actual assessment tool and looking at particular areas that could be incredibly challenging for kaumatua, from a perspective of having quite a big comprehensive clinical tool to go through as a wellbeing assessment, and understanding that there had been feedback that this hadn't been a good experience in the past for kaumatua. And we particularly went through looking at Māori values, talked about Wairua, but also back to items around colonisation and marginalisation, unconscious bias, racism, and things that are going to be incredibly challenging for Pākehā assessing kaumatua in an appropriate manner. Because for this culturally appropriate assessment model to work and to work well, those things have to be overcome. And so we were mapping those concerns across the assessment tool itself, so that when you were looking at various items that needed to be coded, what are the things that we need to think about? Where are the issues? What are the considerations where perhaps intergenerational poverty may have affected these things, or where my concept of what intergenerational poverty may mean for somebody may actually be biased as well before I've even gone into the conversation. So there is an incredible amount of learning that we have identified for assessors, and that's where we really want to partner with NASCs, with Māori health providers, and with everybody who is a stakeholder in this being successful, to raise that level of education for all assessors involved in this process, so that it can be appropriately delivered. And and made successful for those people who are not having a good share of services in New Zealand at the moment because the process hasn't been working for them. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Well, some really big issues to end up the day on, but a huge thank you. And I'm going to hand back over to Teresa, who will farewell us for the day.
So that was an interesting discussion, and these things are complex, and there will always be points of contention. But I think that we've got the ability to work through those things. So thank you, Sally. Thank you, Maria, for bringing that up, and Gabriel for your comments as well. So kia inoi karakia whakamutunga. Unuhia ki te uru tapunui, kia wātia, kia māma, te ngākau, te tinana, te wairua I te ara takatā, Whaiaro e rongo, wakairia, ake ki runga, kia tina, haumie, huie, tāikie, ka kite.